All right, everybody. This is going to be the final episode within this little pod adventure that we've done building these custom rifles. And we've talked a lot about the rifles now at this point. Those have kind of been touched on enough. If you're tuning into this and it's your first episode of the series for some reason, why don't you go back and check those out. Again, the gist of it was Mark had a gunsmith build up for him just the nicest rifle with all the nicest components we could even fathom. And then I tried to put one together with Nick. That was certainly a nice gun. We saw that a little bit today. We're actually out on the range. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that. If you're listening, that might explain the sound of fans you hear as they cool us on this 90-plus degree, 100% humidity day. But
it is hot, Jim.
Yeah.
I'm nearly out of water. I am sweating, and actually I think they call these sweat bees, and they are relentless right now.
So anyway, but I built up with Nick a rifle, like we said. It certainly was no slouch, but it was more what you would call, quote, the entry-level rifle for precision-style competitive or just precision recreational shooting. Mark and I keep entertaining the idea of taking these things hunting as well. Because why not? They shoot so well.
They shoot fantastic.
But what we wanted to go over a little bit today was, like we said, we went over the rifles plenty, but the practical application of actually trying to shoot with these things in the environment in which they're intended for. So Nick so kindly came out to the range with us today, sweated with us a little bit, and set up some kind of what you would see in some PRS NRL type matches. We've got ourselves a PRS barricade behind us, and then also behind us is a rooftop style. I guess barricade or shooting platform.
I just call it a simulated rooftop.
Yeah, simulated rooftop. You can adjust the height and the angle at which it sits, and you shoot from it. And so, anyways, we shot from some of these. I know, Mark, I don't know about you. I'd never shot from any of these types of things before, personally.
Never.
So we got to see. I know we've kidded around both a little bit on camera and off camera. We've joked about how, Mark, coming from your hunting background, you enjoy a lightweight, handy rifle and a caliber that's suited well enough to take down game. And usually you're going to hopefully only put 1, maybe 2 rounds down range. And then my background involves some hunting, but just a lot of I like weird guns, right? And I like going to the range just shooting.
Yeah,
so,
you still need to start that YouTube page, Weird Gun Jimmy.
That's right. Patent pending. So anyway, but as we joked around about these rifles, building them up, they're very, compared to what we're used to, they're quite heavy. And they have, these big, giant, long barrels. They got these loud muzzle brakes. They've got, Arca Swiss rails, and didn't even know what that was going into this. Now I do. And just the different shapes and styles of the stocks and the contours of things and how all the bolt and everything interacts. Even the triggers, which we've talked ad nauseum about the triggers here. We wanted to see how it all worked out when you're actually in a competitive situation. You're on the clock a little bit. You're being competitive. You and I were going against one another. Your heart is racing somewhat. You're shooting at varying distances, or you're shooting from varying positions, and you're trying to do so in as quick but as accurate a time frame as possible. So, I got to say, as soon as the gun came out, I was, for example, I'll throw one thing out right off the bat. I was really liking my trigger at first, that 4-pound, nice, crisp trigger. Now I do really want to lighten it up after doing this and shooting off the barricades. Nick got to show us how to properly post up on one of these barricades. We had this real heavy bag, yet another heavy piece of equipment that these guys carry around. We had a real heavy bag that we'd put over this wood here. You'd have to get in this right position where you'll have to watch the video and see exactly how to do it. But you got to get yourself down, hunkered in. You got to kind of be on the rifle, having the right grip and everything, and trying to impart as little motion into the gun as you can. Meanwhile, also trying to move at the same time and get on target, and then squeeze the trigger.
There's a lot of technique. There's a lot of small things. There's an order of operations. There's things you need to remember.
Yeah.
And, you're talking about, obviously I have predominantly a hunting background, Jim, and I feel like I've developed some habits that are probably actually not bad for hunting, or maybe typical, or, I don't know, maybe some super crazy expert hunter would be like, oh, you're doing it all wrong. However, it's different, and there's things that work for that don't necessarily work for this.
Well, things like, we saw you wrapping your thumb around the stock, which when we've done some carbine training and using rifles that would be considered, your fighting rifle or your rifle that's intended to be used aggressively and stuff like that, you wrap your thumb around it, or on a hunting rifle, you might wrap your thumb around the stock. In this case, we're really trying to minimize shooter input into the rifle while the trigger's being pulled as much as possible. So a lot of these guys put their thumb over on some of these stocks even have a thumb shelf off to the right side for a right-handed shooter for that thumb to rest so it's not torquing on the stock at all. And, and then there was even just transitioning between, talk about, Mark, the bolt.
Right. I mean, that's something that I had trouble remembering, right? And I guess in a typical PRS match, you are going to move from position to position with an open bolt, right? And I guess for me, hunting, particularly on the stages where I was missing, I wanted to get that hit. So I'd rack another one and be like, oh, wait, I need to actually undo what I just did. Yeah. And, then Nick was telling me about sky loading, that's a no-no, right? And I think every time I did it, I caught myself before I moved, but it was still extra time, extra hassle, probably not best practice at all. Right. And it was just difficult it took me 3 or 4 times before I'm like, okay, open the bolt, then move, you know?
Well, it makes a lot of sense, too. And with a lot of these guys running 4-ounce triggers, you don't want to have... when you're running a 4 or 3-ounce trigger, anything can set that thing off. You don't even hardly have to sometimes think about it. Your finger just touches it and it goes off. So you definitely don't want one in the chamber as you're moving around with your muzzle pointing in some various different directions. So yeah, moving around with the bolt open, that was something we had to get used to. And again, I think, you coming from your hunting situation, you take a shot on game, you want to get another one loaded up in the chamber ASAP, right? So you're ready for anything that could happen. So, that happened. Also just trying to remember, too, you take 2 shots, for example, on this PRS barricade. You take 2 shots off the lower one while you're kneeling down, and then you'd have to move and take 2 shots off the next one up, and then make 2 shots off, and 2 shots again. So there's kind of 4 different, there's a lot of different shooting positions.
Sometimes at the same target, sometimes at a different distance target.
Right. On your first one, I saw you were about to take 3 shots off because you kind of got lulled yourself into this, okay, I'm here, I'll take the shot there, I'll take the shot there, then it was like, nope, you got to move. So much respect, I think, coming from us.
Yep.
Despite all the, I don't know how much I've done it in podcasts, but I know around the office I've thrown some. It's been good, all in good fun.
Oh,
I've thrown some shade these guys' way, but there really is a lot that goes into it. You got sometimes the same target multiple times from different positions, or sometimes different positions and different targets at different ranges, and seeing Nick make up his dope card for just that one stage,
right? Throwing
in all the varying different types of wind that he could be experiencing, and throwing in the distances with the calculated dope. Talk about wind. Wind was one thing. Finally, after our first couple of trial runs here, we got to the point where I felt like, okay, I can run up to the barricade, I can throw this bag down and set my rifle up on it, and I can get behind the scope, and I can, get a sight picture and put the reticle on the target, right? So I thought to myself, okay, I've learned the secret to PRS. All you got to do is just be able to do those things, and I'm sure that after a while, you just start doing them quicker. The problem was that then it started to kick up and get windy here. And so I remember specifically ripping off 2 shots where everything in the scope was perfect. It could not have been perfect. And I was even at that time trying out your gun with that just beautiful 8-ounce trigger. And so I'm thinking to myself, it couldn't have been much that I did to the trigger here, but I missed way wide left.
Right.
And then I went through and I kind of cleaned the rest of the targets on the rest of that stage, but I came back and Nick was explaining that. If you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, we'll describe it for those listening, though. There's some just a large swath of tall prairie grass here between us and the targets we were shooting at, between 300 and 600 yards. And one thing I'd completely ignored was the fact that it was almost getting blown down flat about. Not completely, that would be like gale force almost, but it was getting blown down quite a bit. Well, then I was taking those shots, and then it calmed down for the rest of my shots, so I was able to complete the rest of the stage hitting the targets. But it was at that point that I realized, there's more that I have to
need to pay
concentrate.
attention
You
here.
can't just simply put the reticle centered up on the target and expect it to hit it every time.
And it's tough because there really are so many things to remember once you get,
Yeah.
you're moving, you're dialing, you're making those in-the-moment wind calls. And one thing about the wind that really stood out to me that Nick mentioned, when he was making those dope cards, so he had his, what he was going to dial elevation-wise, and then he wrote down 2 wind numbers, and one was a low and one was a high. And in my head, I'm like, well, split the difference, right? And maybe that would work. But Nick was saying that your low or the wind spends very little time in that middle ground. It's either going to be at that low end or at the high end. And I thought that was like super interesting.
It was super interesting. I also found I didn't realize one thing. So Nick was saying most of these competitive guys actually don't touch their parallax in the middle of while they're shooting a stage.
Right.
They'll set it at one sort of middle setting, and that goes against just any time I've been to the range where you're really trying to be precise. You have all this time to set up each shot. You get that parallax just right. You can even get behind it and test it a couple times, shake your head around. You can't do that when you're trying to go and hearing what some of these competitors are capable of. I mean, hearing a guy that goes about a guy that apparently goes and shoots 8 shots from 4 different positions on this PRS barrier at 500 yards on an IPSC target. And he does all 8 shots and hits all the targets, or all of his shots, in 34 seconds or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, you think about that and the pace at which these guys can go when they get competitive.
And we were doing that in about 2 minutes.
We were doing it like 2
even
minutes.
Even a little bit over 2 minutes.
Oh, yeah. You do realize that there's some things that you're just going to have to kind of sacrifice a little bit. So whether that be dialing your parallax and just knowing, okay, well, I better have a good head position behind the gun, or just understand and really understand parallax and how much of an error it can cause, because you might think to yourself, well, even if it does its worst, is it going to still get me off target? And in a lot of cases, it probably wouldn't for these guys. It's the old classic, if I fail this final, will I still pass the class? If I fail this parallax setting, will I still hit the target? But yeah, hearing that, and then also, we dialed, but I'm sure there are guys, especially when you get going fast, that, using those first focal plane reticles, you got to hold over a little bit so you're not wasting so much time dialing.
Well, Nick was saying there's some stages where they say, hey, once you get up there, you can't touch your scope.
Oh,
so
yeah,
then
the
you're
RO
forced
it's part of
to
the rules.
Hold.
Yep.
So, yeah, that was, and I think on that parallax thing, Nick was saying, a middle ground, but even shading towards the longer range, because I think on those closer shots, that parallax is going to be maybe a little less critical.
Well, I think that in a closer shot, it's just the fact that if you do have the parallax error, it has less distance to sort of make itself an issue. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I got to see firsthand, and it's always something that I've known, which is if you go on a lower magnification, you're using a 4.5-27, I'm using a 5-25, didn't even come close to getting the top of the magnification this entire time.
No.
I do that all the time when I'm recreationally shooting because I think, you back down the magnification, it makes finding the target easier. You don't always need to be zoomed in on the thing. But sometimes when you are just shooting for fun and for precision, you will zoom in kind of almost all the way just so you can, why not, right? When you're going quick and you have the potential for wind to become a factor or finding the target in general when you're on these barricades, I never went above 14 power on my Strike Eagle 5-25. And the other thing that I found too was that once Nick finally pointed out the wind to me, I actually had enough on like 12 power, a big enough field of view. I could see that big swatch of prairie grass beneath the target in my field of view while my reticle was on the target, and I could see it. And just before I was about to get ready to take the shot, I could see whether it was really calm or whether that wind was coming in. And then there was a stage where I actually hit every target in the stage, and that did happen. I noticed all of a sudden I went to one target, and the grass was way down, so I held on the right edge of the target, pulled the trigger, and I got 2 impacts in a row. So that was there. That was where that low magnification really came into play.
Yep, definitely. And one thing, from a shooting, I guess, style or whatever, right? Like, Nick and you guys do a really good job of like staying on the gun, staying on target, right? And I have a tendency to want to pick my head up and be like, what happened, right? And I think that a little bit comes from shooting, slightly heavy caliber, lightweight rifles. I mean, you you squeeze the trigger and you are off target, and you're kind of having to
There's a big event that occurs.
Gain your bearings, right? And so like I'm in the habit of doing that, and I almost have to get in the habit with these guns. Like, oh wait, no, I can stay on the gun. I can hopefully spot my impact. I didn't every time, but I did a few times, and work the bolt while you're still more in the optic. It's just kind of a lot of interesting things that you can do to be faster, be a better shot, spot your impacts.
I will point out too. So you talk about recoil there, and we've joked around about the recoil on these 6.5 Creedmoors that we built. They got these big old brakes on them. For us, these guns are quite heavy. I don't think either of our guns even tips 15 pounds quite, but definitely heavier than most rifles we're accustomed to shooting. Bolt action for sure. But we joked around. The recoil's not that bad when you're proing off a bipod with a rear rest. Oh. It hardly even registers on your Richter scale. But I will say, so there, if you look at these barricades, I mean, it's a 2x4 that you're resting your rifle on, right? And you're resting it on a bag. And so it doesn't take a lot to move it off your sight picture.
No.
And so as I'm kind of sitting here digesting the sight pictures that I've seen today, I was really trying to follow through. And Nick described, bringing some pressure into the gun on the bag, and kind of that mag well bumps up against your bag a little bit in the barricade, and then you kind of release a little bit of that pressure, and then you just are able to bring in your trigger finger, and execute the shot with hopefully minimal input. Gosh, these sweat bees are relentless. With minimal input on the gun.
And also kind of holding that trigger to the rear as part of that follow through, which is something again I need to work on.
And that follow through is like is the ability to be able to see where your shot went, right? To call your shot. And that's essential, because then if you're trying to make an immediate follow-up second shot, which we did on every single one of these times, there was 2 shots from every position, you're able to know what happened on that first one, why it happened, for example. And so I was trying to do this, this follow-through, but actually I did find that my gun was recoiling enough that on the distances, until we got up to like 700 yards, which then I had enough time to like get back on target before I saw the splash or the hit. I found that at these closer distances, just the jarring from the recoil, and again, I get it. It's not a lot of recoil, okay? But just enough that I couldn't get back on target fast enough to see where my bullet hit. And Nick would sometimes say, like, did you see where that hit? And funny story. No, I didn't. And so that's where I can start to see where, like, Nick's gun tips the scales at 22 pounds, I think.
Yep.
And he's shooting an even lighter caliber, 6mm Creedmoor than we are. And so a gun like that, I can see where on one of these teetery barricades, that even less recoil would really help you on that follow through. And so now I feel a little less inclined to give them crap for when they go, when they talk about recoil on a braked 6.5 Creedmoor.
Right. Well, and another thing that Nick brought up that it was interesting, because at first I'm like, no, when I'm kind of loading the rifle and into the rifle, that felt more stable to me.
Yes.
And then as we went, and something Nick kind of mentioned earlier, he's like, hey, you may want to kind of get in your position, but then kind of back off the rifle and kind of let the rifle just sit there, free recoil it. And at first I was like, no, I don't want to. And actually, I free recoil a lot of my hunting rifles, but I was like, it feels better to me to, get into the gun a little bit. And as I went on, I'm making this way long-winded, but anyway, I kind of enjoyed the free recoil aspect of it.
Yeah. When you're talking about that free recoil too, and just how you were getting into the gun, so like you do, like in order to get the right follow through, you might be able to just stand off the gun and let the gun sit there, because a lot of these guns are really, I mean, all 3 of ours, Nick's included when he brought it out here, and yours and mine are well balanced enough. They can just sit there, right? But when you pull the trigger, it's going to go kaboom, and it wouldn't still just sit there. It's going to slide back, right? So you have to have some sort of a forward pressure or something kind of bracing the gun there if you want to have any kind of a follow through, or the ability to see where your shot went and see the target. And so what I found was I was kind of having my hand come up and over the scope, and I was kind of having it right around in front of the turrets but behind the objective bell, that nice little spot where your rings go. And I was kind of clamping onto that, and I had a little bit of forward pressure there, and I had maybe even a little bit of forward pressure somewhat, but not enough to influence the gun and push it to the right on the grip. And then I was trying to not have my shoulder, which then has this big lever arm, you know, where it would be contacting the back of the buttstock, that it could move a lot with just a little bit of input.
Yep.
I was trying not to have my shoulder touch it too much. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of experimentation, I think, that one could do, and probably a lot more instruction we could get.
Oh, 100%.
You know, before we kind of figured out just the right spot to be. But it did put into perspective just, you know, all these little inputs, especially as your heart rate gets going and we're moving between barricades. I noticed myself getting shakier and shakier. And then, you know, I'd get the reticle on target. Now I've got a 4-pound trigger that I got to work all the way through. I don't want to slap it.
Yep.
You know, whereas a guy with a 8-ounce trigger or a 4-ounce trigger, 3-ounce trigger, you know, they can kind of work through a little bit of reticle wobble if they start getting a little bit winded, because as soon as that reticle is on the target and they just touch it, it goes off, you know. So I started to learn a little bit. I started to see some things get put to practice.
You know, I mean, it's interesting, though, thinking about that trigger, because even though, you know, I've kind of been shooting this rifle with this light trigger throughout this process, which we've really only shot it, I guess this is day 2 now, really, essentially.
Yeah.
I'm just not used to that light of a trigger at all, you know. And when we started, I had to get used. You know, I even dry fired it a couple times, but still, I had to kind of get used to it. And there was times where I'm like, "Yep, I'm on target," but I was almost initiating my trigger squeeze,
and it would just go.
And
off.
It would just go off. And
yes.
I'm like, in some ways, I wasn't ready for that. And then, you know, throughout the day, kind of again, you got to get to know that trigger on your rifle. And I think one thing you mentioned a couple times, Jim, though, is like, even though you're like, well, yeah, I think I'd like a lighter trigger, right? But you get to know that trigger, and it just becomes part of how you shoot that gun.
Yeah, I was still able to shoot that gun because I did start getting used to it. I could see myself dropping, I think, off from 4 pounds. I could see myself trying to drop off 2.
Yep.
And maybe even 3 pounds, but I want to drop off 2 to start, because there was a certain point, and I do know it's because of getting used to the decent but not PRS light trigger on my Ruger American. I think that had to have been set right at about 2 pounds, because there's this point in my brain and my kinesthetics of everything that has to do with my fingers and the way they're connected to my brain. There was a point where every single time I wanted that gun to go off, I was like, why didn't it just go off?
Right.
It was weird, because I was like, it should have gone off. Like, that should have been it. And then I would have to give it a little bit more, and then it would.
Right.
You know, and so there's just this, whatever point it is in my brain is like that's when any trigger should be breaking. And this one's just beyond that a little bit.
Well, and you probably couldn't pick a worse time in your shooting process to have like almost like a mental hiccup.
Right. Because it's like, it's about
That's
to
when
happen.
it's happening.
Like, you're in the middle of the trigger press there, and it's about to happen, and you're going, wait a minute. And there was even once where I had pressure on the trigger, and this actually should go to show how heavy it is. And people with like 8-pound triggers out there on like some old gun are just laughing right now, right? Some like double action or something. Anyway, but I had pressure on the trigger, and I'm about to let her rip, and then all of a sudden I had to think to myself, wait, what? And I come off the gun out of the scope picture, and I look at the safety.
Is the safety on?
And I go, oh no, it's on fire. And so then I get back into the scope, and then
I did the same thing during that little segment where we swapped rifles, and I did the same thing. I'm like, yep, it's off safe, and then I'm like, oh wait a minute, no. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's
must be
off.
One of those ones where there's like a middle setting or something. Yeah.
I'll say this, Jim, you pretty much started off shooting like a house of fire. I was, frankly, when I started off, embarrassed, because I felt like, I'm like, man, I can shoot a rifle better than this.
And you're thinking, man, all this money invested in this
right.
gun.
I'm like, man, you cannot buy, you can buy accuracy. You can buy an accurate rifle. You just got to be able to shoot the rifle. And that's certainly not what I was doing when we started off. But even with a little bit of practice and some great coaching from Nick, I felt like I saw some dramatic improvement throughout the day.
Let's throw this out there. If you watch the video, you'll have seen this by now. Mark and I did 3 different stages. One stage we did twice, where actually the second time we shot each other's guns. That was kind of interesting. I enjoyed doing that, seeing what your gun was like. But Mark went 2 and 1, and I went 1 and 2. So that one that I won was the very first one, and I kind of came out, and it's just something where I was kind of used to it a little bit more already. You've got a few more gizmos and gadgets, and your trigger and all that stuff that you had to get used to. But you did start to get used to it, and you settled into that thing nicely, and you ended up beating me in the next 2 stages that we did. And, I think that even with further practice, that thing, you can continue to get better and better with that thing. And it is a hammer. The one Nick and I built is a hammer as well, but
that thing shoots,
I don't know.
Jim. Your groups at these, 500-600 yards are like these itty-bitty groups, right?
Mm-hmm. It's hard to say at this point in time whether or not, I just think that our skill level is not quite to the level where we can say this rifle is better than this rifle by this much. It is difficult. I do think deep down, like I truly believe, and when Isaiah shot your gun, we sort of saw your gun does shoot a little bit better than my gun.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, I think, remains to be seen exactly maybe how much. Maybe also over the course of time, how yours holds up over the course of time. And so
really none of them, for a person that's going to reload, which a lot of, PRS guys, precision guys do, we've been shooting factory loads with these things, and they're shooting phenomenal.
Right.
But that's something where we're talking about even earlier in the podcast, where if mine shoots better, you might be able to do some tweaking and catch up to it for sure. Yeah.
So when it comes back to it, I think maybe somebody listening to this is probably more on the beginner side of things because you're wondering, is it worth it to go to, the gunsmith and spend all this money and get all the Gucci parts, or is it worth it to try and throw something together yourself that still has nice parts? And don't get us wrong, like we've said in the other podcast, we're still talking 4 figures here to get a rifle that's going to compete well. Yes, there's the factory route, but we're enthusiasts here. We're talking about custom building. So just kind of take that variable out of the equation. But I could go both ways, actually. I don't know, like, in me being the kind of person who's always like, build it yourself, DIY, throw it together, do it on the cheap, whatever. It'll work, piss off some people that spend a ton of money when yours does almost just as, whatever. I think Nick and I happened to put together a rifle that went together well.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things that we would have done differently now after talking to a gunsmith like Isaiah that might have made it even go together a little bit nicer. I don't know if they all go together that well. That's the one thing that's holding me up because I haven't put together like 100 of them, for example.
Right. It's a focus group of 1.
Yeah, exactly. Focus group of 1. This one came together well, and it shoots really well with factory ammo. If I went out and I put together another one, I'm thinking of me as the variable here, the builder in this case. I don't know if it would be as consistent. I don't know if I could expect the same things out of another one that I built versus I'm pretty sure if you had Isaiah build 100 of them, they're all going to come out almost identical and they're all going to be really, really freaking good.
And if one doesn't, he's going to say, hey, give that thing back to me. Let's figure this out.
Well, yeah. I mean, when the guy goes, this is shooting 1 MOA, there's a big problem. I think you've got yourself. That's when you find yourself in this nice situation. It is. I think reassuring when you have something that you can have such confidence in.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're able to pick out things like, nope, it is me in this case. It's got to be me. It's got to be the data I'm giving the scope and the rifle. When you can just eliminate all those variables, it's a good thing, I think. We came out in good shape with both of these rifles. So like I said, it's hard for me to say that if every single one of you listening out there went out and built one just like Nick and I did, that it would come out just like ours did. I don't know yet. I'd love to hear some other people's opinions on that who have done maybe one or multiple of these Remage builds and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I think both, paths have their merit, have their advantages. I think the custom gun builder path with the Gucci parts, that's going to be kind of like you're going to know that you've removed all those variables.
Yeah.
Yours, Jim, you guys learned some cool stuff on the way. You got the satisfaction of like, wow, I did that myself, and look at that, it shoots straight. That's amazing, right? So you're getting kind of a different set of satisfaction out of that, perhaps. But both have their merit. Both these guns shoot incredibly well.
Let's throw one other thing out. I thought I was done with mag problems. Not quite.
Not quite.
Not out of the woods just yet. It seems like these guns, these precision rifles, can be a little bit picky.
They're a little finicky
with their magazines.
With the magazine, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Nick came in. He had like 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of mags that we tried amongst all of our guns. Even still, we had some feeding issues here and there. So I think I didn't try in my gun every single type of mag that could possibly be compatible with my gun, so I'm sure there's a magazine out there that would fit better. There's certain things. What do they call the things that get put in the magazine?
Oh gosh. We said it at some point in time.
I know, we
Not
did
a
say
feed
it.
lip.
No, it's a thing in the
stop.
magazine. MC Ryan, do you remember what that thing was called?
Well, we'll figure it out.
There was something where it was like, oh, this magazine has a blank in it, and it just helped keep the rounds seated all the way back against the rear.
I think it kept them seated back, and it helped them feed up, because my rounds, and I think maybe
They
even
kinda
your rounds,
nosedive
were
a
wanting to
little bit.
nosedive, and they'd get jammed. And to your point that you're making, Jim, like for Nick, and I mean, he lives, eats, sleeps, and breathes precision rifles. And he's coming in with like 5 or 6 different mags. It's like this noon, just like, oh, that's a fact of life. You got to find the right magazine for your gun.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, there's a little bit of toying around that you got to do there. I mean, when they work, they work. And you see these guys just buttery smooth, just and they just can run everything through there. Us, again, being brand new, these rifles being pretty fresh, we still have yet to figure out the exact right combination of magazines and how they're seated, little accessories that go along with magazines. I don't know. Isaiah even said he could toy around perhaps with yours to make it feed better with certain stuff. Mm-hmm. Who knows? But that is something that is worth noting. If you're around someone who has maybe a lot of experience and they've been shooting for a while, they may have different mags they've tried and have come and gone. They might be able to let you try some if you try building one of these things or having one built. So just be aware, that is possibly one little hiccup. I know that's the biggest thing I would say, aside from the trigger on my gun, that I want to try and figure out is which magazine and what all will make it just feed like butter.
That's a good thing to figure out, Jim. I got to bring up one more thing. I
Yeah,
don't want
do
to
it.
make this go forever.
No, dude, that's all right.
But the level, I mean, so this wasn't even an actual, I guess it was kind of a competition between
Sort of,
us,
yeah.
right? Like a private competition. 2 stages, whatever. The amount of adrenaline and stress and like mental taxation that something as simple as this induced was shocking to me. Like, I'm at the end of that last one, like my hand was shaking.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same that I felt when I've done some 3-gun competitions, Mark. It's like 3-gun for stuff that's really far away and with bolt actions.
Yeah, I don't
And
like
with one
stress.
gun. So never mind. Nothing like it. But the amount of adrenaline that you feel is.
That is the same. And that was super interesting. Super interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, for everybody out there, again, like we've said before, if you have any questions about how all this stuff went, I'm going to look at this one. MC Ryan says, look at that one. All right. So for everybody else out there, anyway, like I said, if you have any other questions on this, definitely hit us up. Let us know. Instagram in the YouTube comments works. But we'd love to hear if you're putting together or having built a rifle, let us know what components you're using. If you figured out like the best magazine that works in every single gun ever, definitely let us know about that. If you share with us any guns that you have built too, we'd love to see them because we're gun nuts as well.
Super fun project, Jim.
Cool. All right, everybody. Enjoy yourselves out there on the range. I usually say happy hunting and shooting, but then I started with enjoy and I didn't know where to go from there. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. All right. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye. All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. Again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.